This is the Biz News Podcast, one-on-one conversations with experts in business and personal development.
If you were to ask 11 people if they thought they were ethical in their business, 12 of them would probably say yes. But we see on the news every night at 6 that's just not true. So where's the disconnect? And if there's a general answer, why? Rick Swegan may have an answer. He's co-author of the new book, The Practice of Ethical Leadership. He's also founder and principal consultant of Arch Performance of Wexford, Pennsylvania. He joins us for this Biz News interview. Why is there such a disconnect between what we think and what is reality?
Yeah, I give you the short answer on that, and in my humble opinion, the answer to that lies in the organizational culture. And what I mean by that, if you think about the reward system that exists in a place, who they make heroes out of, who they communicate about, all of those things underpin or undermine, I should say, the best of intentions. Because I agree with you fundamentally. If you go into a large room and say, how many of you consider yourself ethical and law-abiding? 101% will say they do. But something happens when they get in organizations that changes behavior.
When it comes to having a good, quote unquote, ethics, isn't that just something that we should have learned as toddlers?
Yeah, I think so, frankly. And what it actually points out as well is how hard it is to teach that. I mean, if you think about it, and here's why I say that. You think about the Boy Scouts, for example, any church as another example, all of them teach basic human values, how to treat one another, the golden rule, those kinds of things. And yet people go out and misbehave. They know the rules, but something changes for them and changes their direction, if you will. And I don't have an answer for that other than to say, if we eliminated lust, if we eliminated greed, if we eliminated venal sins, we're probably okay, but we're not going to do that. I mean, quite honestly, at least you and I aren't.
Well, what do you suppose today's acrimonious, that's a polite way of putting it, political scene, how does that impact trying to have an ethical society these days?
That's a great question, Doug. I mean, and I'll give you my personal opinion on that. I think part of being an ethical leader and having an ethical organization is the willingness and ability to speak up, okay, to challenge the status quo, to raise critical questions, to disagree, okay? And I think to your point, that has become minimized in our society. And at one point, I would have said to you, and again, this is my opinion, it's a political issue. I mean, you look at our politicians, the acrimony in Congress, et cetera. I think that has trickled down to basic level of society, to small town America, and what has happened, and I think this takes place in our organization, business, and other organizations as well, is people have learned to challenge, to scream, to yell, to shout down others rather than rationally disagree. That's what I see. That's my assessment of what's going on in society.
You have written a book about
Yeah.
ethics in business. Tell us about it. First, start with the title and then give us a synopsis if you can.
Yeah, the title is The Practice of Ethical Leadership. And I emphasize that because I'm not an ethicist. I'm not a philosopher by background. My background and my co-authors is really how do organizations behave, how do leaders behave. So the genesis of the book, the core, if you will, is in three things, from my opinion. One is, can I hire ethical leaders? Because going back to your original question, right? Can I hire people who will be moral? Can I hire for character? I mean, we hear that word bandied about a lot in politics. So that's one critical theme. Second critical theme to your earlier point is, can I develop ethical leaders? And honestly, I'd say that's a lot harder because are we going to change you and I? Probably not. And then the third piece we focus a great deal on is just the impact of the overall culture. So those are kind of the three themes, but it has, as the title implies, pretty practical orientation to say, how do I apply this in my organizations? And I would say as well, we don't make a value judgment. As a human being, I have certain values, okay? But I think the critical issue for an organization is, do we talk about what our values are? Do we agree on those values? Do we agree on how they're going to be acted out, how we're going to behave with one another? My point with that is, and I'll name names here, I think an organization like Hobby Lobby, which has got a very specific and very strong Christian orientation, is and has consequently taken stands on abortion and other hot button issues from their particular vantage point, is every bit as ethical as Amazon, for example, who has taken a completely contrary point. When the Dobbs ruling came down from the Supreme Court, they said, okay, if you need to go elsewhere for an abortion, we'll help fund it. Both of those live their values, slightly different values. They will come to different resolutions on key issues. But the key point to me is, does everybody know what they're getting into? Are they on board? Can they process those values? You look like you had a question there.
Yes, I've got one, and that goes back to what you mentioned a few minutes ago. How do we as managers manage to hire ethical people asking the right questions without kind of stepping into areas that will bring us the call from the lawyer or at least the HR department?
Well, I can't guarantee the HR department, but I can pretty well guarantee the legal department. Um, I think it's a couple things, frankly. I mean, most organizations, and I'll generalize here, I don't know any organization that doesn't have some interviewing process. Okay. Um, I'm a huge believer that you have to interview, and the best predictor of behavior is past behavior. So if I want somebody who is ethical, tell me about a situation where you had to make a morally ambiguous decision. What did you do? I think it's more likely that if I get that kind of data in the past, I'm going to get that in the future. Okay. And most of the evidence supports that. I also think you need to break down what constitutes the key behaviors for ethical leaders. Most of the organizations that I deal with, and I do a lot of this, look at integrity if they look at any component of ethical behavior. And that's a fabulous construct. Don't misunderstand me. I want high integrity people. But if I think about ethical leaders, they do certain different things, I believe. First of all, they have to have a sense of right and wrong. I mean, it's kind of the Platonic vision, or maybe it was Socrates' view of the philosopher king. I want people who see beyond the bottom line to process, is this the right decision for our people, for our community, for the environment? So that's critical component number one. Secondly, can they critically reason about issues? And I say all this because you can evaluate that in the interview process and through other tools. Can they reason effectively? Can they arrive at appropriate conclusions? Are they willing to take a stand? And I think that's a critical one. Are they willing to stand up and challenge authority, challenge the status quo? And the other part of that is, are they aware of consequences? In other words, I make a decision. What are the implications on that decision for my people? How will they react to that, et cetera? So if I look at those four things, kind of the mindset, critical reasoning, the empathy, if you will, and willingness to take a stand, I've divided down ethical behavior into subcomponents. And I can measure that in a number of different ways. One of the tools we use, for example, we use case studies. I mean, give people a case study that has some ambiguity in it, not a cut and dried answer. You may have a bottom line issue. You may have let's say your company is polluting. You've got employee morale that is low. Typically, those are a couple pages, fairly complex. And then what we do is ask people to come in and present their decision. And what happens with that? What happens with that? You get an opportunity to see people in action. You get an opportunity to challenge them and see how they respond. And you get a very clear picture of how they reason about moral issues. So, let me just add to that, and then I'll let you ask a follow-up question. I've been doing this for 40 years. Most organizations don't hire for ethics and character. And I think that's part of the reason we're in the position we are right right now.
Is it because of fear, again, of overstepping their grounds and uh, violating some rule, regulation, or even a law that has led to this, or what?
You know, I think that's a more of a philosophical question, Doug. I mean, and I'll give you an example of that. There's a school of thought out there that says if I represent a certain company, my company sells a certain product, I should take no stand on anything, because I potentially turn off customers, um, offend people, etc. So certainly a school of thought. It's not one I agree with. I tend to agree with the other side of the argument, and I'll give you an example from Pittsburgh. You probably know Dick's Sporting Goods. Dick's is headquartered in Pittsburgh, big operation, and historically has sold a lot of hunting supplies, rifles, guns, etc. Ed Stack, who was the CEO at the time, after one of the shootings, I think it was the Sandy Hook school massacre, pulled assault weapons unilaterally from his stores. Said, we're not going to do that. I can understand all the arguments about, guns don't kill people, people kill people, blah, blah, blah. So we're not going to sell them. That to me is taking a stand. And I think that honestly is what more leaders need to do. He recognized full well that he was going to offend some of his customers. But he was willing to do it because he thought it was the right decision.
But perhaps even as importantly, if not more importantly, he would offend his investors.
But possibly he had a huge share of the company. So
So I guess that really doesn't matter
no,
if you own
that
three
forgive it.
quarters of it or whatever.
Yeah,
You can tell the others to go live in a broom closet.
yeah, but let me give you another example then, and we use this in the book. Levi Strauss, makers of Levi's. Chip Berg at the time when we wrote the book was the CEO of Levi's. Very active. I mean, when President Trump put in the immigration ban on Muslims, he spoke out against that. He spoke out about gun violence. He's taken very specific stands very publicly, which some might label as liberal. But in his case, it's built on the history of the company and the founder, because Levi Strauss had a huge orientation to do that. So he's living the mission of the company. But to your point, he runs a risk, right? Anybody who takes that stand potentially does, either via shareholders, their board, or their customers.
If you wanted people to take two or three things away from after reading your book, what would those points be?
Let me give you 4 words for that, and we'll try this out. You want to be Bombas, not Boeing. And let me explain what I mean by that. You may not know Bombas. Bombas is an apparel company. You ever watch Shark Tank? Okay, so in 2013, they went to Shark Tank to get funding, and they made socks at the time. That's all they did. And their premise was, we're going to make high quality socks, and for every one you buy, we're going to give a pair to a homeless shelter. They're now a $500 million company 10 years later. And my point with that is they make money. They charge a lot for their socks while doing good. Okay. You look at Boeing, on the other hand, and obviously they've been in the news recently. And I'm not implying, by the way, that the people at Boeing are unethical, because I think certainly at the shop floor level, you've got people who care about their jobs, are ethical, trying to do good work, etc. But leadership has gotten in the way. And my point with that is, when I say 4 words, be Bombas and not Boeing, who do you want to go work for? Okay, that's number one, because that's part of the equation, right? And all things being equal, I want to work for Bombas because I can go home at the end of the day. I don't care who you are in the organization, and feel I've made a contribution. Where if I'm in Boeing under the current situation, there's pressure to move faster. There's pressure in a lot of different ways. Company doesn't like, people don't like us. And that's a long-winded way of as well of saying, if you fail ethically, the repercussions are potentially disastrous. I mean, who knows the outcome is going to be with Boeing. But to give you another example, and this is on the nonprofit side, take the NRA, for example. The recent scandals around misuse of funds by senior leaders, and the almost immediate impact on that was they lost 20% of their members almost overnight. People pay attention to that. I think people not only want to work for ethical companies that have a higher purpose, they want to buy from them, they want to support them, et cetera. It does have an impact on the bottom line. So the fundamental message is, if you're taking one away, is how do I know that I'm not Boeing, and how do I create a culture that is analogous to Bombas, where we're doing good for the community and people leave feeling like a greater mission and a greater contribution.
Rick, would you give our listeners and viewers a website where they could get more information about you and your book?
Yeah, there are two really. The easiest one is a website called ethicalbottomline.com. Makes sense. That's part of the title of the book. And that can give you access to information about the book, as well as contact information with me. And my company is called Arch Performance. So our website is archperformance.com. Either way. And I would also say I'm happy to link in with people via LinkedIn and talk more directly as well. And you can find my name on LinkedIn easily enough.
Well, Rick, what would you like to add that I haven't been bright enough to ask you?
Boy, that's a really good question, Doug.
It is almost unending in an answer.
Well, I think I'll go back to the don't be Boeing. I mean, if there was one message in all this that I would want people to take away, is kind of, how do you know you're not Boeing? I mean, how do you know that the guy working the night shift is doing the right thing? And I think any organization owes it to themselves to evaluate their ethical culture. Because what I perceive our culture to be at the CEO level may be radically different than what it is at the front line. And I need to know that. I need to know where the gaps are. I need to know where we're not behaving before I can do anything about it. So to me, it's assess the culture first.
You've been listening to the Biz News Podcast. We welcome your input. Send your email to editor@biznews.com. That's BIZGNUS.com. Thanks for listening.